The morning sun broke over Joe Miller's north pasture in a pale band of gold, turning dew on the fescue into a sheen like hammered tin. Samuel Hart stood with one hand on the handle of his fencing pliers and the other resting lightly against the weathered top rail. His eyes tracked the spread of light as it slid down into the hollow, waking the damp grasses and coaxing a faint steam from the earth. The farm had been his father's before him, and his grandfather's before that, carved into the ribs of the Ozark Hills, where the land rolled and folded like the muscles of some great sleeping beast. At his feet sat Ranger, a German shepherd with a coat of slate and silver that glinted when the sun touched it. The dog's ears were pricked forward, his amber eyes scanning the tree line that pressed close against the pasture's edge. Samuel bent and ran his calloused hand over the thick ruff of the dog's neck. "Fence holds another day, old boy," he muttered. Ranger thumped his tail once against the damp soil, but his gaze stayed fixed on the woods. Samuel wasn't a man who wasted words. 42 years on this earth, most of them spent working land that gave grudgingly but steadily, had carved him down to the essentials. His frame was lean from labor, his hands hardened into tools. His beard was more grey than black now, though his eyes, pale green, sharp and wary, still belonged to a younger man. Farming wasn't easy. He never expected it to be. But it was honest, and after the noise of the world beyond the hills, honesty was the only balm he'd found. He pocketed the pliers, adjusted the strap of the rifle slung over his shoulder, and whistled low. Ranger rose instantly, body shifting into that fluid readiness that always reminded Samuel of coiled springs. They cut across the pasture toward the far fence line, where the hogs had rooted again in the night. The ground showed fresh churn, clumps of dirt upturned and grass mangled into mud. Samuel crouched, measured the width of the hoofprint with 2 fingers, and clicked his tongue. Big boar. Mean one, too, by the look of it. Ranger sniffed the air, then dropped his nose to the ground, tracing the scent line toward the timber. Normally, the dog would stay locked on quarry until Samuel called him off. Today, he froze. His head snapped left, ears swiveling toward a darker draw that cut down into the hillside, a wound overgrown with laurel and vine. A low growl rolled out of his chest, so faint it seemed borrowed from the earth itself. Samuel frowned. Not hogs. Ranger ignored the fresh trail completely and pulled, muscles straining against an invisible leash, toward the ravine. Samuel trusted the dog's nose more than his own judgment. He shifted his rifle, set his jaw, and followed. The descent was rough. The slope fell steep and slick with moss. Ranger moved sure-footed, glancing back to make sure his master kept up. Branches clawed at Samuel's shirt, slapped cold water against his face. The air down here was different, heavy, damp, and still. He felt it pressing close, as though the ravine had never been meant for men to walk. At the bottom, a wall of vines curtained a shape that didn't belong. Ranger whined and pawed at it, claws scraping against something hard beneath the green. Samuel shoved the growth aside and stopped dead. What stared back was not stone. It was metal, painted once in drab olive, now scabbed with rust. His breath hitched. He tore away more vines with shaking hands. An angular form emerged, the battered carcass of a machine. A rotor hub twisted like a broken crown. A tail boom snapped and buried under dirt. He didn't need to see more to know. The shape had been burned into his mind from years of service manuals and news footage. An Apache helicopter lay on its side like a bull brought down in mid-charge. He stepped closer, boots sinking in the damp earth. Time had done its work, ferns rooting in seams, vines draped over shattered blades, but nothing could soften the violence of the impact. The canopy was cracked into a spiderweb of acrylic shards, the cockpit tilted into shadow. Samuel's hand hovered above the fuselage before he dared touch it. The metal was cold, even in the warming sun, as if it remembered fire. Ranger pressed close to his leg, silent now, eyes sharp. "Lord help us," Samuel muttered. He circled carefully. The wreck had wedged itself into the ravine's wall, one side crushed, the other half buried. When he eased the vines from the cockpit glass, his throat tightened. The pilot was still there, bones strapped in the harness, tattered remnants of a flight suit clinging to him like cobweb. Samuel swallowed hard, tugged off his cap, and bowed his head. He wasn't much for prayer, but he gave the man a moment. Duty tugged at him then, that old instinct farmers and soldiers alike carried. When you find something broken, you figure what to do with it. He scanned the cockpit. Amid the chaos of shattered dials and wires, his eyes fixed on a stout gear case jammed under the co-pilot's seat. It looked military issue, sealed tight, untouched by weather. He braced a dead branch under it and levered hard. Metal screeched, then gave way. The case toppled out onto moss. It was heavy, locked, nothing he could open with a farmer's tools. He set it aside, rubbing the sweat from his palms when Ranger barked sharply. The dog had his nose pressed against the rudder pedal floor, pawing insistently at a panel. "You got something, boy?" Samuel crouched, pried with his knife. The panel popped free. Behind it, nestled in foam, was a ruggedized hard drive sealed in plastic. He lifted it out slowly. This wasn't standard gear. This had been hidden, a secret. His gaze dropped back to the skeletal pilot. A frayed strip of name tape clung to the collar. Mercer. "Captain Mercer," Samuel said softly. "You didn't want this found, or maybe you did." He slid the drive into his pack, gave the fallen man one last nod, and climbed with Ranger back into the light. Back at the farmhouse, the drive sat heavy on the table while Samuel powered up his old laptop, a relic he mostly used for weather reports and seed catalogs. He connected it to the small satellite dish mounted on the roof and slotted the drive. The screen answered with a wall of encryption, layer upon layer of gates and prompts. Military grade. More locks than he'd ever seen. Samuel cursed under his breath, trying passwords, dates, anything simple. Nothing worked. The drive might as well have been a block of stone. Frustration gnawed at him until Ranger nudged his knee, whining softly. Samuel exhaled, rubbed the dog's head, and leaned back. If there was a key, it wasn't here. It was still back in that ravine. They returned at dawn. The wreck looked darker in the early light, as if the forest wanted to reclaim the secret. Samuel searched the cockpit inch by inch, but it was Ranger who found the first clue, a wafer-thin metal tag half buried in dirt. Etched into it was a substitution cipher, A1Z26. Next, Samuel carefully slit the collar lining of Mercer's suit. Inside was a polymer strip with a date, 7/2019. Back home, he entered the letter ZKR followed by the date. The drive clicked open. File directories bloomed across the screen. Samuel read in silence. Shipping manifests, weapons not surplus but top of the line, communication logs between voices hidden behind codenames, and a video file. He played it. The screen lit with an office of steel and glass. Behind the desk sat a man in his late 40s, sharp-jawed, eyes cold as Riverstone. The nameplate read, Nathan Cross, CEO, Aegis Tactical Solutions. Samuel knew the name. Everyone in uniform did. Cross ran one of the largest private military contractors in the world. In the video, Cross was finalizing a deal with an Eastern European buyer, selling American weapons into black markets soaked with blood. Samuel's stomach twisted. This was treason, plain and simple. Ranger growled low, as if he too smelled the rot. What Samuel didn't know was that the moment he cracked the drive, a hidden program pinged his satellite dish, broadcasting his coordinates. Cross's network now knew exactly where he lived. That night, Samuel noticed Ranger pacing the porch, restless. The dog froze suddenly, head tilted skyward. Samuel followed his gaze. High above, barely a speck, something hung motionless. No buzz, no wing beat. A drone. Military grade. The bottom dropped out of Samuel's stomach. They were coming. He bolted the shutters, moved heavy oak furniture against the doors, laid out his rifle and his father's old Colt. Ranger paced, hackles up, every muscle coiled. The woods fell silent. Even the frogs hushed. Then came the crunch of boots in leaves. Ranger exploded at the door, barking with a fury that rattled the panes. The assault began. The first blow shook the farmhouse door on its hinges, rattling every board in the frame. Samuel braced his back against the wall, rifle already shouldered. Splinters burst inward with the second strike, wood groaning. At the same time, the sharp crack of glass shattered from the kitchen window as a rifle butt punched through the shutter. Gunfire erupted, bullets tearing through clapboard walls, chewing into plaster. Samuel rolled low across the floor. The .308 clutched to his chest. He came up at the corner window and fired 2 quick shots into the black square where the shutter dangled. A cry went up outside, cut short. But there were more. Too many. He crawled on elbows and knees toward the back, every breath sharp with the sting of dust. Ranger tore back and forth, barking like thunder, throwing himself against the door as if he could hold it shut with his teeth. Samuel hissed through clenched teeth. "Out, boy. Now." He pointed toward the small bedroom window. Ranger understood. He leapt onto the bed, crashed through the flimsy glass in an explosion of shards, and vanished into the night. Samuel jammed his pack over one shoulder, snatched the Colt from the table, and booted the back window open. Gunfire ripped through the front again, deafening. He dove through the gap and hit the ground in a crouch, rolling into the wet leaves. Chaos erupted on the far side of the house. Rangers' savage growls, men shouting, a brief scream. Samuel sprinted low into the trees, heart hammering. He whistled twice, sharp and low. Ranger appeared out of the dark, muzzle slick, eyes blazing. They didn't look back. The farmhouse roared behind them with the stutter of automatic fire, muzzle flashes flickering through the boards like a swarm of lightning bugs. Samuel knew the house would not stand. They had no home now, only the woods. They ran until their lungs burned, deeper into the folds of the hills where no roads reached. Samuel's muscles screamed, his breath rasping, but he pressed on. Beside him, Ranger flowed silent and tireless, a ghost of silver fur in the dark. Hours later, when moonlight spilled weakly through the branches, Samuel collapsed beneath a limestone outcrop. He pressed his back against the stone, chest heaving. Ranger stood at the edge, ears tall, scanning. Samuel dragged the laptop from his pack, hands trembling. He opened the drive again, not to review the damning evidence, but to search for something, anything that could guide him. That was when he noticed a corrupted system file buried deep in the directory. Most of it was nonsense, scrambled beyond use. But one string stood intact, a line of numbers, coordinates. His pulse jumped. He knew LandNav well enough to recognize the format. He scribbled them into the dirt with a stick. The mark sat far southeast, deep in the national forest where the ridges pressed close and hollows stayed drowned in shadow. If Mercer had hidden evidence there, it was their only hope. The laptop's battery died then, screen blinking out, leaving him with only the dirt-scratched numbers and Ranger's steady breath in the night. The trek began at dawn. Samuel rationed what little food he'd grabbed, mostly jerky and cornmeal biscuits, and gave Ranger the larger share. He carried the .308 slung across his back, the Colt at his hip, every sense wound tight. They avoided trails, bushwhacking through thickets of laurel, sliding down steep draws where streams gurgled under rocks. For days, they moved like ghosts. They slept shallow, back to stone, Ranger always half awake. Once, while skirting a ridge, Ranger froze flat, ears locked forward. Samuel dropped beside him, peering down into a narrow road. 2 black ATVs crawled along, each carrying armed men in tactical gear. One held a handheld device, sweeping it back and forth like a divining rod. Trackers. Samuel's gut clenched cold. These weren't hunters who gave up easy. They had his scent. He and Ranger lay pressed into the soil for nearly an hour, unmoving, until the machines rattled out of sight. Only then did he breathe again. He stroked Ranger's back, whispering, "Good boy, we keep moving." Nights blurred into one another, each a repetition of hunger, silence, and the endless press of trees. Samuel's beard grew wild, his eyes sunk deep. He felt himself slipping back into the skin of a man he thought he'd shed years ago, the fighter, the survivor. On the 7th morning, the sound reached them first, a low rumble, distant at first, then swelling until it filled the hollow. Water. They followed it, scrambling down a stony ravine until mist cooled their faces. The waterfall burst into view like a vision. 100 feet of water poured sheer from the cliff above into a deep emerald pool, spray rising in veils. The coordinates matched. Samuel's eyes scanned the rock face. Ranger darted along the edge, nose working furiously. At last he whined, pawing at a wall of dripping ferns. Samuel shoved the greenery aside to reveal a narrow fissure, black as the throat of the earth. Cool air wafted from within. They squeezed through. Samuel's flashlight cast a narrow beam that pierced the chamber beyond, and there, waiting on a dry rock pedestal, sat a black pelican case. His hands shook as he lifted the latches. Inside lay papers sealed in sleeves, shipping manifests, transcripts, memos bearing Nathan Cross's own signature. Next to them, a memory card labeled Video Evidence, and beneath all that, a thick vacuum-sealed envelope. Samuel tore it open and read the neat block letters inside. "If you're reading this, I am already dead. Cross discovered I was compiling evidence. The crash was no accident. Do not trust the agency. Do not trust command. His reach is everywhere. The only contact I trust is Daniel Price, journalist. A sat phone is hidden in the Widow's Moor mine. The map enclosed will guide you. Use the tunnel at the back of this cave. Godspeed, Captain David Mercer. Samuel unfolded the laminated map. It showed a network of mine shafts spidering beneath the hills, with one route marked in bold red. Widow's Moor. Ranger stiffened suddenly, head snapping toward the fissure they'd entered. His growl rumbled low and deep. Samuel froze, straining past the roar of the falls. Then he heard it, the faint scrape of boot on stone. They'd been tracked. Samuel stuffed the evidence into his pack, cinched it tight. He flicked on the flashlight and turned toward the dark tunnel yawning at the back of the cave. "This way, boy," he whispered. They plunged into the mountain's throat. The air grew cold, thick with damp and dust. The roar of water faded behind them, replaced by the drip of condensation and the thud of Samuel's heartbeat. Ranger pressed close, his presence a steady guide in the suffocating dark. From far behind came shouts, then the sweep of white beams slashing through the fissure. The mercenaries had entered. The Widow's Moor swallowed them whole. The tunnel narrowed until Samuel had to stoop, the beam of his flashlight trembling over rotting timbers and damp limestone. The air smelled of wet stone and rust, every drip echoing like a hammer strike. Ranger stayed pressed against his left leg, silent but taut, his ears twitching at sounds Samuel couldn't yet hear. Behind them, the mercenaries' lights sliced through the darkness, pale cones sweeping across the stone like the eyes of hunting wolves. Voices echoed, distorted, but close enough to tighten Samuel's chest. He doused the flashlight to conserve the battery, plunging them into pure black. He placed his left hand on the wall, shuffled forward, and trusted Ranger. The dog stopped suddenly, nudged his muzzle against Samuel's thigh, and pressed him rightward into a side shaft so narrow Samuel's shoulders scraped both walls. They slipped inside and held their breath. Seconds later, two beams swung past the main tunnel. Heavy boots clattered, their echoes fading. Samuel leaned down and whispered, "Good boy, keep us alive." Ranger's tail brushed his leg once, firm as a promise. They pushed deeper, winding through a labyrinth where every passage looked the same. Samuel's pulse hammered, but Ranger moved with uncanny certainty, guided by scent and the faintest tremors in the air. At last, Samuel spotted a faint glow ahead. He raised his borrowed night vision goggles, the ones he'd taken from a fallen man outside the farmhouse. The cavern bloomed in spectral green. They had reached a junction where 4 tunnels met. Samuel crouched in the shadow, Colt ready in one hand, the M4 he'd stripped from another mercenary slung over his shoulder. Ranger lay flat at his side, silent. A rhythm approached, the deliberate crunch of a single pair of boots. A beam of light swept ahead, then a mercenary entered the junction, rifle raised, scanning. For one instant, his back was turned. Samuel exploded from the shadows, silent and fast. He swung the butt of his pistol into the base of the man's skull. The mercenary dropped without a sound. Samuel dragged him into the dark, stripped him of magazines, radio, and a fresh pair of night vision goggles. He fitted the goggles over his own head, and the world lit again in eerie green. Ranger's eyes glowed like twin moons. They moved on. Minutes later, they spotted another mercenary crouched 200 yards down a long tunnel, rifle steady, watching. Samuel pressed his mouth close to Ranger's ear. "Go round, make a noise." The dog slipped into a parallel shaft. Samuel waited, rifle braced. A sharp bark echoed from the left, followed by a tumble of loose stones. The mercenary flinched, swung his weapon toward the sound. Samuel squeezed the trigger. The suppressed rifle coughed once. The man toppled. Samuel whistled low. Ranger reappeared, padding back out of the dark, eyes bright with fierce intelligence. Samuel ruffled his ruff, whispering, "2 down. Good work, partner." The radio crackled in his ear. "Kilo Sierra, report," a voice ordered, calm and edged with steel. Silence. The voice sharpened. "Status now." Another voice, younger, answered shaken. "Sierra's down. Kilo Dark, pulling back to extraction." "Negative," the leader snapped. "Rendezvous in 5. We burn the asset and scrub the site. No witnesses." Samuel's blood ran cold. They meant to collapse the mine, bury everything, him, Ranger, and Mercer's evidence, with it. He unfolded Mercer's laminated map, luminous in the goggles' glow. The sat phone was marked in a maintenance station deep in the mine's central chamber. The mercenaries were headed there too. The collision was inevitable. "Time to finish this," Samuel whispered. The chamber opened vast as a cathedral, the ceiling lost in black, stone pillars rising like ancient trees. Rusted machinery sat scattered, skeletal and strange. And across the cavern, two men worked quickly with satchels and wires, explosives set against the supports. The leader moved with lethal grace, tall, precise, every motion efficient. The younger one fumbled, nervous. Samuel crouched behind a collapsed minecart, sighting down his rifle. He exhaled and squeezed. Bullets sparked off stone as the leader spun, reacting instantly, goggles glowing like a demon's eyes. "Contact!" he shouted, and the chamber roared with automatic fire. Samuel dove behind cover, stone shards biting his cheek. Ranger growled low, crouched flat, waiting. Gunfire echoed so loud it blurred into thunder, ricochets singing. The mercenaries split, flanking expertly. Samuel fired short bursts, pinning the younger one, but the leader closed in on the right, fast as a shadow. The muzzle flash bloomed white in the goggles. Pain lanced Samuel's left shoulder, spinning him against the cart. His rifle clattered away. He gasped, arm useless, Colt slippery in his bloody hand. The leader advanced, rifle leveled for the kill. Ranger moved first. He launched with a roar not like a bark but a primal snarl, 65 pounds of fury slamming into the man's gun arm. The rifle spun away. They crashed hard, Ranger's jaws locked on flesh. The younger mercenary swung his aim toward the dog. Samuel forced his trembling hand to steady, lined the Colt's sights and fired twice. The man dropped. The leader managed to throw Ranger off, fumbling for his sidearm. Samuel staggered to his feet, Colt raised, vision swimming. "Don't," he rasped. The man froze, chest heaving, hands slowly lifting. Ranger stood beside Samuel, teeth bared, fur bristling, ready to tear him apart. Samuel zip-tied the leader's wrists with strips from the man's own gear, shoved him face down against the stone, and took his radio. Pain flared hot in his shoulder, but clarity cut through. He turned to Ranger, who pressed close, eyes searching his face. "We're almost there, boy." They pushed deeper into the chamber, following Mercer's map, every footstep echoing against stone walls slick with moisture. The air smelled of iron and old fire, heavy with a silence that seemed older than the mine itself. The beam of Samuel's flashlight cut across jagged rock and collapsed beams until at last the cavern widened. Against the far wall crouched a small brick-walled station, half swallowed by shadows. Its bricks were blackened with soot, the mortar crumbling with age. A warped wooden door leaned half open on rusted hinges, groaning like a dying thing when Samuel pressed his shoulder into it. The sound rolled through the chamber, louder than thunder in the oppressive quiet. Inside, the air was stale, choked with dust and the faint tang of oil. Old tool chests slumped against the wall, their lids bent and hinges snapped. Shards of glass from broken lanterns glittered faintly under the light, like stars trapped underground. In the far corner, half hidden by debris, sat a metal box, edges eaten by rust, yet intact enough to hold its secrets. Samuel crouched, heart hammering, fingers trembling, as he dragged it into the light. The scrape of iron against stone seemed to echo forever. He pried the lid open with the point of his knife, the metal shrieking in protest. Inside, cushioned by scraps of oilcloth, lay a satellite phone. Unlike the ruin around it, the device was untouched by time, clean, dry, its surface still gleaming faintly. The sight of it nearly stole the breath from his chest. For years, Mercer's warnings had seemed like whispers of a dead man, fragments of paranoia. Now, in his hands, was proof. His fingers shook as he thumbed the power switch. For a long, heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then the screen flickered, casting a pale glow that painted his dirt-smeared face in cold light. A tiny icon appeared, signal bars, weak but alive, blinking into existence like the first stars after dusk. Samuel fumbled for the crumpled scrap of paper Mercer had pressed into his hand, what felt like a lifetime ago. The numbers written there blurred under sweat and exhaustion, but his memory filled the gaps. With a deep breath, he punched them in, each button press echoing through the chamber like a tolling bell. The ring cut through the silence, once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th, a voice answered, steady and low, yet tinged with caution. "Daniel Price." Samuel's throat tightened, his lips parted, but no sound came at first. The weight of the moment, of the years of silence and buried truth, pressed on him. Finally, his voice scraped out, hoarse and raw. "My name's Samuel Hart. Captain David Mercer trusted you. I have everything. The manifests, the comm logs, the video evidence. I'm sending it now. With trembling hands, he slid the memory card into the slot, his breath shallow, pulse hammering in his ears. His thumb hovered for only an instant before pressing transmit. A progress bar crawled across the screen, the files leaping into the unseen ether beyond the mine's stone skin. On the other end of the line, there was a sharp inhale, then silence. When Daniel spoke again, his voice was cracked by awe and disbelief. God Almighty, you don't know what you've done. This will bring the whole thing down. Where are you? Tell me right now. Samuel's head sagged against the wall, every muscle heavy with fatigue. His voice was barely above a whisper. Widow's Moor mine. Ozarks. But I don't know how long. The phone chimed, a warning beep that stabbed the quiet. The connection stuttered, signal faltering, as though the mine itself tried to swallow the truth back into darkness. The glow of the screen blurred. Samuel blinked hard, forcing his eyes to focus, but his strength was bleeding out of him. He slid down the wall, every scrape of brick against his back dragging him closer to the ground. His chest heaved, each breath ragged. The edges of the chamber dimmed, as if shadows closed in. Through it all, Ranger pressed close, the weight of him warm and steady, his heartbeat thrumming like a drum Samuel could cling to. Samuel's hand fell into thick fur, grounding him, anchoring him in the storm of fading strength. Ranger pressed at his side, warm and solid. 2 days later, sunlight seared his eyes as hands pulled him out of the mine. The first breath of clean air was like fire in his lungs, sharp and unyielding, but alive. Men in FBI tack vests swarmed the site, their radios crackling, boots hammering against stone. Agent Mark Hollis strode at the front, voice hard with command, every gesture signaling the operation had reached its conclusion. Daniel Price was there too, dust-streaked and relentless, his eyes burning with conviction. He held evidence like scripture, unshakable, undeniable. Hours turned to days, and before the week was out, Nathan Cross was dragged into custody in a dawn raid, his empire collapsing like rotted timber, the darkness he had built exposed under merciless light. The country learned Captain Mercer's name at last. He was no longer a ghost consigned to footnotes and whispers. His sacrifice, buried beneath years of secrecy and lies, was laid bare in speeches, medals, and folded flags pressed into trembling hands. Streets were renamed, a plaque was mounted on courthouse stone. His family stood in silence as honors were pinned to an empty uniform, the nation's gratitude ringing hollow yet necessary. Samuel, watching from the edge, knew the man deserved more than ceremonies. He deserved memory, and that Samuel would carry. Months passed, summer thinned into autumn, and the Ozark ridges caught fire with gold and crimson. Wind scoured the valleys, stirring leaves into restless dances. Where Samuel's farmhouse once stood, a new home rose from the scarred foundation, timbers set by neighbors, paid for with money that had traveled quietly, discreetly, from those who knew what he had endured. Gratitude had no single face. It moved through anonymous envelopes, unmarked donations, calloused hands carrying lumber without question. By winter, a chimney puffed steady smoke into the cold sky. Samuel sat on the porch one late afternoon, the sling gone, his shoulder healed stiff but serviceable. He turned the handle of a mug in his hand, coffee steaming in the cool air. The field stretched before him, quiet except for the faint rustle of deer at the tree line and the whistle of distant hawks. Ranger lay at his feet, the dog's coat clean and gleaming once more, his eyes soft yet always alert. He shifted, nudged Samuel's hand with the insistence of loyalty that never wavered. Samuel smiled, an unguarded smile that felt unfamiliar on his face, as if his muscles had forgotten the shape of it. He rubbed the fur behind Ranger's ears, and the dog sighed, settling back into his post with tail flicking lazily against the porch boards. They had walked through fire and silence, carried truths meant to stay hidden, and come back into a world that, somehow, still held light. The hills held their breath around him, quiet, ancient, and unchanging. The scars remained, on the land, in his body, in the memories that would never soften completely, but they no longer held him captive. Samuel Hart had endured, and in the slow turning of the seasons, he found what he thought he had lost forever. And in that stillness, with the sky burning orange over the ridges, and a dog's loyalty steady as bedrock, Samuel Hart finally found peace. But peace, he realized, was not the silence of forgetting. It was the strength to remember and still rise with the dawn.